Okay, I got a lot of requests on my channel to talk about Sino-Russia relationship, and before that, the Sino-Soviet relationship. Remember, I make a video saying that the Warring State era is the most important era in Chinese history. I bet after a few hundred years into the future, historians will probably consider the post-World War II era to be also the most important time in the Chinese history. The Chinese government is education system is very blurry when it comes to modern day Chinese history. Perhaps it is still ongoing, and discussing and commenting openly in public, especially on the mistakes the Communist Party of China have made over the years, can be seen as a challenge to its authority. In, I would say, recent years, China's overall economic success has given Chinese intellectuals and scholars more room to openly discuss the events of past 7 decades, okay, since the beginning of the founding of modern day China. The government with greater confidence seems less embarrassed to, let's say, revisit and reflect on some of its early challenges and mistakes. Today, I want to take this opportunity to talk about Sino-Soviet relationship in the early decades of Communist Party rule in China. I would like to share a short clip from Professor Wang again, since he has put a great deal of effort into producing insightful videos on modern Chinese history. And also, I think he's one of the scholars that is not afraid sometimes, to challenge the official authority. Professor Wang has been invited to tea by the Chinese government several times in the past. I think many Chinese audience here in my channel knew that. However, I think AI software translation I used struggle a little bit with Professor Wang's video here, so I will pause from time to time to correct some translation error. Okay, let's play the clip.
From the Cold War to the post-Cold War period, China is a very interesting example. What happened with China? We provided a general overview of the transition from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period. After that, we looked back at what happened with China during the Cold War and what happened in the post-Cold War period. We are all aware that at the onset of the Cold War, where exactly did China position itself? It was situated in an intermediary zone contested by the two dominant blocs, aligning with neither the American bloc nor the Soviet bloc. This was because during that period, the United States primarily they supported the Republic of China government, represented by Chiang Kai-shek. And what about the Soviet Union, despite during World War II? Acknowledging that the Chinese Communist Party had established a substantial base in Yan'an and had already become an undeniable force. Nevertheless, even after the war, and as China embarked on post-war political and economic reconstruction, the Soviet Union continued to adhere to the historical materialism framework derived from the Eurocentric foundation, which is the Marxist theory of the 5 developmental stages. And it was transformed by Stalin into a rather dogmatic judgment, which was that the Chinese Communist Party belonged to a peasant party. Since China didn't have an industrial revolution, it didn't develop large-scale industrial production or create a proletariat to support it. The working class within China has not yet fully formed, so it is not possible for you to establish a working class party, nor can you possess the defining characteristics of a proletarian vanguard. Consequently, the Chinese Communist Party exists just prior to the bourgeois revolution, a pre-modern peasant revolution party with a nationalist nature. This definition was clear in the Soviet Union's view of the Chinese Communist Party at the time, and it has consistently been judged this way since the inception of the CCP, because you are merely a group of intellectuals with a preliminary understanding of communism. Your country is seen as pre-modern, so start with a bourgeois revolution. Once it sets up a bourgeois regime, it will guide society into industrialization. This process will create the working class, the gravediggers of the bourgeoisie. As the working class struggle begins, conditions will be right for forming a proletarian vanguard party, enabling your Communist Party to shift from a peasant party. Only after China embarks on comprehensive industrialization can the proletarian party effectively fulfill its essential role, spearhead the working class revolution, and unite with the international working class movement to establish a worldwide workers' revolution. You cannot independently achieve a revolutionary victory. Therefore, the Chinese Communist Party at that time mobilized the peasants through a land revolution on Chinese soil. Triumph serves as the sole testament in the world. That's why he wasn't part of the US and Soviet Union's main systems. Their post-war Cold War setup solidified their ideologies, making them internal political correctness. Anything not aligning with this is seen as an outlier. China is the outlier. From the start, he didn't fit into these two systems, yet you call him communist. Well, it's not because the leading communist country was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union never considered China to be communist and didn't even regard the Chinese Communist Party as a communist party. They thought it was a peasant party. That's why Mao Zedong said he fought with Stalin all his life. Both sides ended in a draw, mainly because the Soviet Communist Party did not truly embody the nature of a communist party within the entire communist world. This was clearly defined by the Soviet Union. It also means that China could not be fully integrated into the Soviet-led communist ideological system. So that's how it started. Therefore, we say that everyone must have the patience to carefully summarize what the Cold War ideology means. Summarizing the experiences and lessons of the Cold War aids us in comprehending the concept of today's new Cold War. Why was there a conflict in the relationship between China and the Soviet Union during the old Cold War? It was because China was not considered a communist party and was not included in the communist bloc. So it was an outlier from the beginning, naturally, because it was such an outlier. So, the Soviet Union, led by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the United States, had established geopolitical control in Asia after World War II, limiting the Chinese Communist Party's army to a maximum of occupying north of the Yangtze River and south of the Yangtze River. It should be by. The Republic of China government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was to occupy the area. This relates to the two major powers in this Asian region, because the Asian theater was another battlefield in World War II. The main battlefield of World War II was Europe, which had already been divided into two parts, right? Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Germany was divided into East and West, and even its capital, Berlin, was split into two parts. It became an enclave, but there had to be East Berlin and West Berlin. This was the result of the two major powers in World War II dividing the world and controlling geopolitics. And in East Asia, North Korea and South Korea were formed. Creating North and South China and North and South Vietnam. This was the strategic need for geopolitical control by the two superpowers in World War II. Because China was an outlier, it didn't listen. Not listening led to crossing the Yangtze River and liberating China. However, the Soviet embassy still followed the nationalist government to Guangzhou. He did not completely abandon the Republic of China government just because the Chinese Communist Party occupied Nanjing. From the perspective of the geopolitical division of secondary battlefields in Asia, which was not the main European battlefield, as agreed upon by both the United States and the Soviet Union. The goals that each side wanted to achieve were disrupted by China, this outlier.
Okay, I need to pause here because the AI didn't do a good job. First, Professor Wang said that the Soviet never considered China to be part of the communist community because it lacks the industrial credential to be one. China was in the pre-industrial era, pre-industrial stage, so it had no working class by Soviet definition, only farmers and peasants. And nationalistic elites running the country in China who were also mostly just peasants and farmers before that. And to be honest, at that time, the world was still at the height, I will say, of European centric semi colonial mentality. Soviet's focus was mostly in Europe. The other thing mentioned here, according to the professor, was that the original agreement or under the table understanding between the Soviet and the United States was to divide China into two parts, North and South. The North controlled by communists and the South controlled by KMT backed by the United States, just like how Germany was divided. Neither US nor the Soviet want to see a united independent China, communist or not. That will be, I would say, bad for control and maintain sphere of influence. So Stalin originally advised Mao to compromise with the KMT and even suggested a coalition. Chairman Mao, however, given the military advantage at that time, insists on unifying the entire China and ignore basically both the Soviet and the American suggestion. So the Western narrative here is that the US lost China to communists. The reality is that the US and the Soviet was planning to craft China up, but Mao didn't cave in. Let's continue the video.
However, China hasn't achieved unification, and Taiwan remains a bargaining chip for the United States. Please note that the Soviet Union did not fully establish its control over China and, in reality, was unable to exert complete control over it. In the year 1949, the Chinese Communist Party successfully completed the establishment of its governmental regime on the mainland. During this significant process, a major event that subsequently occurred was the Korean War in the region of Northeast Asia. The Korean War was essentially concluded at that point in time. The Soviet Union employed military apparatus to exert control over the Chinese military forces in this particular manner. As part of the control process concurrently to assist in the Korean War, heavy equipment industries were relocated to specific regions within China. This relocation led to a comprehensive control over these regions, extending from the superstructure down to the economic base owing to the industrial characteristics. Particularly with an emphasis on heavy equipment industries, the respective government must be organized in a manner that aligns with the necessities dictated by industrial capital. A government with strong structural control. And the government that emerged from the peasant revolution was unable to establish such a regime. Therefore, I initially formed an economic system in the Northeast with the help of Soviet experts sent to China, where even the factory's technical workers were sent by the Soviets. The government was also established with the help of experts sent by the Soviet Union, not to mention that during the Korean War, the military was aided by the Soviet advisory group in planning and deploying the war, and even in directing the battles, the Soviet military advisory group was directly involved. Objectively speaking, although we urgently trained a group of Russian translators at that time, unfortunately, he did not believe it was sufficient. The war orders could not be directly communicated through Chinese translators. At that time, the two Guard Air Divisions operating on the Korean battlefield were elite units of the Soviet Air Force. It could only be the Soviet military's mobilization. And without these two Guards aviation divisions, transportation north of the 38th parallel could not be guaranteed. You have to rely on railways and highways. The protection of railways and highways can only depend on air power. At that time, China's limited air force was simply incapable of providing the necessary air cover to protect the transportation lines. It could exclusively be the Soviet Union, which regrettably lost over 200 fighter pilots on the Korean battlefield. In the end, the Korean War, which was supported by both the US and the Soviet Union, ended in a ceasefire at the 38th parallel, with both sides reaching a stalemate. So whenever Koreans or others ask me for my analysis of the Korean War, I say, please take a look first. Who was really behind this war? Although the US and the Soviet Union, along with China and North Korea, were on one side, and the opposing side consisted of 16 countries with the United Nations forces supporting the South Korean military, in reality, it was the world entering the Cold War phase after World War II. This was a geopolitical division between two superpowers, creating a process of geopolitical control throughout the entire Asian region. This significant event is the Korean War. This occurrence is merely a step in the broader geopolitical division between the two opposing sides. It cannot be perceived as solely an issue between the Koreas, nor merely an issue involving China, North Korea, or South Korea and other Asian nations. Instead, it ought to be regarded as an event in the post-war world entering a phase of geopolitical division, and this particular event has now been concluded. The geopolitical split in Northeast Asia. Before the Korean War officially broke out, the United States also attempted to turn China into a buffer zone. At that time, the agreements reached between the United States and the Soviet Union after the war were essentially aimed at having China controlled by both sides, by both the US and the Soviet Union. Therefore, whether we discuss the Cairo Conference or the Yalta Agreement and similar accords, all of these were fundamentally international agreements primarily formed by the United States and the Soviet Union to establish geopolitical control in the post-war era. They do not genuinely reflect or safeguard any substantial interests of China during the signing of these agreements. These should be perceived in this manner. Post-colonialism, or the post-colonial era. As developing countries, we lack the power of discourse, institutional rights, and even negotiation rights, which results in unfair treatment for developing countries. Let alone all those things like the later San Francisco Agreement. You have to see that it was the two major powers, the US and the Soviet Union, first in World War II, then the Cold War after World War II, and then the hot wars within the Cold War. This series of treaty changes all reflect the interests of these two major powers. Geopolitical interests, and so after going through this series of significant events, notice that China, which was initially regarded as an outlier by both sides, acquired a very crucial core element, which is that China must uphold its independence and sovereignty as a nation-state. So, despite China having almost completed the full-scale Soviet-style transformation by the early 1950s, from the military sector to the government sector, to universities, to research and all areas of the superstructure, it was essentially dominated by Soviet experts, collaboratively assisting the Chinese in mastering the management of Soviet-style industrial systems. Helping China advance Soviet-style education and Soviet-style research is necessary for serving the industrial system formed by the Soviet model. You are only able to cultivate management cadres. When all of these aspects have been completely realized, even the military uniforms were in the Soviet style. The military ranks, management rules for ranks, and combat rules were directly copied from the Soviet Union. In this specific situation, China has effectively achieved a redependence. 1949 was about ending dependency. Nevertheless, by the conclusion of the Korean War in the year 1953, China had indeed transitioned into a renewed state of dependency. This fresh dependency was predominantly on the Soviet Union, which was recognized as the leader of the communist world.
Again, pause here for a minute. That's a lot of material to digest, isn't it? What the professor said here, which is entirely true, I would say, is that the newly formed China as a nation barely has the ability to run the country, let alone industrialize. The entire Chinese population at that time, including the leaders, lacked the knowledge and experience to progress and industrialize the country. And to put it into perspective, if you look at the Western country in terms of social development and industrialization, let's say it was at a 10 at that time. Okay, China was at a 0, maybe barely a 1. You can't just say, hey China, here's some books and here's some money, go modernize your country. It doesn't work that way. Okay, it took the Western countries centuries of progression to get to a 10. It would be much easier to move a country, let's say, from a 7 or 8 to a 10, but China was barely considered a 1. Chinese consider Stalin to be a brilliant strategist. His calculation during the Korean War was that if North Korea wins, the Soviet will have a solid warm water navy base in the Korean peninsula, projecting power into East Asia. If North Korea lose, the US-led coalition will march all the way towards the Chinese border. The Chinese Communist Party will be begging the Soviet for protection, accepting perhaps Soviet military troops deployment, which basically will result in China turning into a vassal. The Soviet could then use Navy base in China to project power into the Pacific. Unfortunately for Stalin, Chairman Mao was running the country. He understood very well what it means for China when Soviet deploy its troops and military bases in China. In fact, Mao's insistence in going into the Korean War is against Stalin's original plan, and what Professor Wang here consider a distortion again to the Cold War world order. By participating and holding off the US-led coalition in Korea, China in return received Soviet support when it comes to industrialization. And we're not talking about making shoes and socks, we're talking about heavy industry, which perhaps in one of my future videos I will talk about how it is essential for a country to want to maintain a higher level of sovereignty. You need to have a higher degree of heavy industries. And China successfully industrialized without turning itself into a Soviet vassal. Professor Wang was right here. Everything China learned and adapt at that time were all Soviet. Okay, we basically copy and paste everything, not just Soviet technology, but the entire governing structure was from the Soviet. Now, pay very close attention to what Professor Wang has to say in the final part of this video, okay?
From this particular perspective, the reason I specifically mentioned that China played an exceptionally crucial and disruptive role during the Cold War era is because throughout this period, the Chinese were particularly wary of this dependency, potentially leading to the loss of our national sovereignty. This is quite distinctive. Consideration should be given to the fact that when the Soviet model appeared in dependency, the redependency of Latin American and East Asian countries was primarily on debt. Next is the reliance on tech equipment. These nations industrialized mainly due to transfers from Western countries. They barely had the chance to build their own industrial systems. As a result, they faced national failure in the 1980s and 1990s. What about the communist world depending on the East? Wouldn't the same issue arise? It's quite challenging for us to predict what might transpire. We can only witness the actual unfolding process. Beginning in the mid-1950s, a significant phenomenon started to manifest, which was when the Chinese, in the realm of industrial development, industry being the primary economic foundation, began to undergo a process of dependency, and consequently, the question of how to depend emerged. This separation began by the Communist Party of China's Central Committee in the mid-1950s. Chairman Mao Zedong proposed that this dependency possesses dependency dividends. These dependency dividends are distributed between the leading nation and the dependent nation. A portion of it is distributed among the beneficiaries. So what exactly does it possess? It possesses the motivation for the beneficiaries to collaboratively maintain this dependency system. It is inherently endogenous. And the more frequently this particular type of regime is established through peasant-led revolutionary movements. Because of an insufficient comprehension of the fundamental structure of the world, the dependency that is formed becomes increasingly adhesive. It led to an institutional dependency. So when Mao Zedong, chairman of the Communist Party of China, proposed moving away from full Sovietization in the mid-1950s, the challenges he faced were primarily attributed to the advantages of dependency that had objectively arisen within our political framework, along with the interest groups that partook in these dependency benefits. By them. Adjustments are challenging because you are dealing with a complicated interest structure. Behind it are groups that have already shared in the benefits, making change difficult. And this interest group further manifests as the bureaucratic, dogmatic, and formalistic system of management that was brought over from Stalin. In 56 and 57, young intellectuals criticized this as the three hornets' nests not to poke, as poking them would cause a reaction. A group of people would come out and sting you, not a swarm of bees. This was referred to at the time as the three major hornets' nests of bureaucracy, dogmatism, and formalism, because it was directly copied from the Soviet model, so it couldn't be changed. Whether it suited China's national conditions or not, it couldn't be altered. So in this situation, there are indeed challenges from within. A group of young intellectuals is challenging the interest groups formed by this system. Well, that is approximately around the year 55 when China commenced the endeavor to transform the internal motivation of full Sovietization. By the 1950s, China had accomplished a thorough Soviet-style departmental configuration. Whatever departments the Soviet Union possessed, we fundamentally had the equivalent. The quantity of industrial ministries they maintained, we essentially had the same quantity here. The configuration and departments within the Soviet Union were fundamentally identical to what we possessed here. The organization of their military was reflected in our system, and their industrial administration was duplicated in our framework. This was entirely replicated. What departments does a Soviet university have? We have the same. What textbooks do they use? We use the same textbooks. It was almost entirely copied, and the inertia formed by this copying is very difficult to break. Even if the top leader, Mao Zedong, wanted to change it, could this vast system follow his lead? So although China is an anomaly, it has internally completed a system modeled after the Soviet system. For instance, when Mao Zedong proposed to change the complete Sovietization, everyone unanimously told him it couldn't be done. We lack the capability. Why is that? How would the factory be managed? If there were no Soviet experts, who would manage the factory? How does this equipment operate? How do the different pieces of equipment fit together? All of this relied on Soviet chief engineers and technicians, and even if there were malfunctions during the operation of the equipment, Soviet technical workers would assist in handling them. In the early 1950s, we were still fundamentally an agrarian nation. Approximately 70% of our cadre team members were semi-illiterate or completely illiterate. Well, a significant portion of what was called literacy was achieved only after joining the revolution and attending literacy classes. Truly, there were very few who reached a level capable of managing modern industry. So in this context, it's understandable why those financial officials didn't agree with Mao Zedong's suggestion to fully adopt Soviet-style reforms. During this stalemate, there was no way to alter the sting of the three major hives: bureaucratism, dogmatism, and formalism. We won't go into detail about this story, but just to mention that China, as an anomaly, is pursuing its national sovereignty and independence. In this process, it is indeed increasingly difficult. Internally, it is almost impossible to make adjustments. Therefore, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China proposed that at the very least, we must clearly express to the Soviet Communist Party that we are not a subordinate party, nor are you a superior party. You cannot command me. We are in a fraternal party relationship, and at least in this inter-party relationship, we need to show some independence. For example, why is the Hungarian incident so sensitive? Up to now, many debates have remained inconclusive. The Chinese Communist Party says we don't agree with your approach to fraternal parties. Yet, documents translated by the Soviet Communist Party claim the Chinese Communist Party praised the Soviet Union's handling of the Hungarian incident, which is true. Naturally, the Soviet Union wouldn't admit the Chinese Communist Party opposes them. But if you check the Chinese Communist Party's statements, they want to change being controlled by the Soviet Union, so they express different views. We disagree with your stance on fraternal parties, but you always see it. Is the Chinese Communist Party stirring things up, initiating a criticism against the Soviet Communist Party's control over the entire communist world? And ultimately they labeled it as the so-called social imperialism. During this process, could the tool that the Chinese Communist Party actually utilized for mobilization be the original version of Marxism borrowed from the Western world? What can exclusively be utilized is Mao Zedong thought, or what is referred to as Maoism. What does this Maoism predominantly signify? It signifies the nationalist aspirations of a nation-state that has successfully completed an independence war to uphold national sovereignty, and it embodies the essence of nationalism. Why was it able to garner nearly nationwide support during this period? It's due to its nationalist traits. So, people were eager to help, which is why you see the sacrifices of a whole generation of Chinese people. It's to keep the nation's sovereignty and independence. Everyone used their limited labor capacity to maintain the basic economic growth of the country. So in those years, although the economic growth rate was not as high as it would be later, it still generally remained around 7%. It was still the highest growth rate in the world. So during that era, it relied on manpower and of course on contributions. What kind of mobilization was used? Nationalist spirit. In actuality, what was accomplished was the industrialization process of state capitalism. Transitioning forward, it is understood that this nationalist mobilization within China is not solely effective on a domestic level. If we expand this concept a bit further, it becomes apparent that it also exerts a relatively substantial influence on the international stage. But let's pause for a moment.
I want to expand this last portion of the video a bit. Professor Wang, not just in this video, but in many other videos, described the interdependency of China towards the Soviet after adapting the entire Soviet system into China. This process ultimately created an internal oligarchy class in China that is Soviet-leaning, both in terms of economic interest and political alignment. And it is very difficult for Chairman Mao to navigate the situation, to both continue growth and modernize while maintaining as much sovereignty as possible. This problem was faced later also by Deng Xiaoping, again during China's realignment towards the West, how to adapt and benefit from the US-centric system while maintaining China's sovereignty. And today, Xi Jinping is at a crossroad again. After decades of Western dependency, a Chinese oligarchy class that's pro-US has formed. This group has strong financial and even political interests and alignment with the United States. And in this new era of turbulence we're in today, 2025, how can China continue to progress while not risking domestic instability? I believe President Xi today understands the difficulty of this task and the danger China may face if he plundered the situation. I will like to make more video in the future and talk about this dependency, how foreign ideology and capital can erode sovereignty so much sometimes the country's political system turned basically into an empty husk. If you compare people like Mao or Deng Xiaoping or Xi Jinping to, let's say, today's so-called leaders in Europe, they are mostly just like puppets, unfortunately. No offense to Europeans. And in most, if not all, global South countries, you can see that struggle between a country's nationalistic elites and their, problems against, let's say, an oligarchy class that's often completely obedience to a foreign entity. And that can be the United States or just the US dollar, the US financial system. I can tell that some audience in my channel can see the world from my perspective as well, but most people in this world, Chinese included, have no idea what I'm referring to here. And once you see that relationship structure, the term democracy will become less meaningful, I would say. For example, Germany. Your democracy may give you certain freedom in deciding the direction of economic development, but it never really gave you any right for political alignment. Today's Germany do not have the right to decide to switch alignment from, let's say, the United States to China, not until US power projection collapse in Europe. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Have a good day.